the respondents are here, so we can go ahead with our questions and answer session. And I'm going to conduct it exactly the same way as the session after the third and fourth sessions. The tables with questions indicate that. We'll hear the questions, we'll get the answer, and then we'll hear from that table any suggestions they have in relation to the ballot paper. And again, brief and as possible. And I would suggest, certainly in relation to the questions, no repeat questions. Very good. So I'll start with table 6.
Hello, Judge,
Yes.
and the panel. I'm the facilitator for table number 6, and I have 2 questions. The first question is, the citizens of table 6 wish to know, is it feasible or possible that persons who are looking to vote can vote at any polling station? They don't necessarily have to be linked to electoral division. The citizens were suggesting maybe even a barcode or an ID card that they can present at any polling booth so that they can vote, and how feasible that is. The second question that citizens at table 6 have is, in the event that a super referendum is done and multiple topics have to be voted upon, they wish that they will be broken down into 3 criteria: a moral referendum, a technical referendum point, and a legislative referendum point. Because they felt that if there was duplication there was 2 moral issues, it might blow the smaller issues out of the water. So they wish to separate them into various categories.
Yeah, and you'd like to know the views on that?
Correct.
Yeah, very good. Well, then the first question, the feasibility of being able to vote at any polling station.
I can't answer that as a technical question,
Yeah.
but of course it must be feasible.
Yeah.
It happens in other places, and
Yeah.
it happens with postal voting. So you just need something that's like postal voting, where you have something identifiable. It shouldn't be too difficult. In the US, you can often vote early at your polling station, but because we don't have permanent polling stations, you wouldn't be able to do that because the school would be in session.
Yes.
In terms of breaking up groups, I can see some merit in that. I guess moral ones are the ones that people get most excited about. But if you didn't have those, if you didn't have the right range there, it might be difficult.
Yeah. Therese, what's your feeling on it?
Just in relation to could you vote at any polling station? I mean, that's done in lots of other countries. I've seen it done in elections in Central and Eastern Europe in several places. There's provision to have a name added to the voters list on the day of the election. It does require each voter having a unique identifier, though, either a number that's specific just to the electoral register or a public services number. Which we already have. Everybody has
PPS,
a social security number, a PPS number, but you do have to have that security to ensure the integrity of the vote. But it's common in other places, but it would require some degree of overhaul of the existing procedures. Early voting could fairly easily be facilitated in the local authority offices in each city and county council area. Where anything up to a number of weeks before the vote, if your name was on the register, you could vote at the city and county offices, and then your name could be crossed off of the electoral register. So when it would go out to the polling stations, there would be a record of the fact that you had already voted, and the ballots could be reintegrated at the count. Again, that's effectively how postal voting works anyway.
And what about the super referendums and
Super-referendums. I mean, I think
range of topics?
Yeah, to a degree, I suppose you have to go back to where referendums come from, and they don't come forward in that kind of an organised way. We might go for a decade and not have a moral referendum.
Yes, yeah.
So, I can see why intuitively that's an attractive idea, but I think in practice, we'd have to be very careful about how we would see that working, because we don't kind of collect referendum questions, I suppose, in that way.
Yeah. Now, do you want to tell us your suggestions for the ballot paper?
Yes, the citizens at table number 6, there are 4 suggestions for the ballot paper. Number 1, the moving of polling days to weekends.
Yes.
Number 2, that all citizens eligible to vote upon turning the age of 18 are written to by the state with registration papers. Question number 3, that whether or not to reduce the voting age to 16 and to place the onus on schools to register students to vote. And the final question is the creation of an information day whereby the Electoral Commission or some authority like that are permitted to attend at schools to explain the merits of voting to young people, to engender a culture of voting among young voters.
Very good, yeah. All right, what table? Table 3.
I'm the facilitator for table 3. The citizens at this table have 1 question and 2 suggestions for
we'll do the
the ballot.
question first.
The question is there a correlation between countries with a high number of citizens' initiatives and political stability or instability?
Yeah, that's a good
Do you have any knowledge of this?
There isn't a hard and fast rule. Citizens' initiatives are used all over the world, and they're used in democracies and non-democracies and transitioning democracies. And the other thing is, stability is not something that we can kind of put our finger on and say, you know, what is stability? We might measure that in different ways. So, yeah, I couldn't give you an answer to that question, I'm sorry.
Do you have a view, Michael?
I think it's very interesting, but the problem is what does stability mean? But
Yeah.
take 2 incredibly stable democracies, Britain and Switzerland. You know, one's had initiatives for ages and ages and ages and highly decentralised government, and the other is pretty centralised and has never had initiative.
Yeah. But it is an interesting question, if I may say so. And then your suggestions.
2 suggestions. That any Irish citizen be able to vote at any polling station in the country, and that Irish citizens living abroad for up to 5 years be given the opportunity to vote by post.
Yes, thank you very much. Will we go to table 5? Yes, table 5.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator at table 5. We just had, the citizens at this table just had 1 question. What months could we move voting to get maximum turnout?
I think that's a toss a coin one, is it?
I could tell you about days of the week, because I checked that. I didn't check months, but I think you'd have to say you wouldn't have it in midsummer for fear that people would be away on holiday or they'd be in America on J1 visas. And on the whole, the feeling is that this time of year, apart from people like your good selves and of course me, people don't want to go out. So I'd say spring or autumn is probably the best time.
Teresa,
I agree with Michael on that.
Very good. Well, at table 5, what suggestions have you?
So to have flexibility around internet voting or to vote by post, compulsory voting, the turnout threshold.
Are you recommending compulsory voting?
So to vote on, yes, whether there's, to give people an option whether we should vote or have people vote compulsory. The turnout threshold, super majorities, and then the last one, to have more flexibility to allow for multi-option voting.
Very good. Thank you very much. Table 8, or is it 12? Sorry, 12.
I'm the facilitator for table 8 or table 12. A member at this table had a question for Dr. Reedy. They wanted to know her view on reenacting Article 44, in particular in the context where obviously the Whitaker report was very much against this. However, it's been quite some time since the Whitaker report, and have things changed since then?
Yes.
I just don't think there's a straight answer to that question. It's tied up in kind of the bigger issues that I went I went through about how you would structure the initiative and how you would think about it intersecting with the existing representative democracy structures. So an agenda initiative would be if you want, a cautious step down the road of taking initiatives. Instituting full provision for citizens initiative would be in the agenda spectrum, a more revolutionary or more radical step to take. They are in place in a number of our European neighbours. They were introduced in a lot of constitutions in former Soviet states when they were democratizing in the 1990s. They went into a lot of constitutions, but they've been used very variably in those states. So some countries use them frequently. Other countries which on paper have equal provision for initiatives haven't used them at all. So it has a lot to do with kind of politics in that particular state, and in particular how both political parties and civil society decide to engage with the initiative. In some countries, civil society are very active, and they use initiatives to keep their to really bring extra attention to their proposals, to put them on the policy agenda, to get a lot of attention and public debate about them. In some countries, political parties, particularly opposition political parties, use instruments like agenda initiatives, to draw attention to kinds of things that they're campaigning on, to give prominence to key members of their party so that they're in the media, they're active in debates. So they use them for, if you want, political reasons as much as for policy reasons. So there are different arguments on either side, but if you were going to reintroduce it, you'd want to keep those kinds of things in mind in terms of the conditions that you would put around it and how you would envisage it being used. And you'd probably want to give some thought as well to procedural rules like signatures, how many, how long would you have to collect them? If it was going to be sent to the Dáil, for example, what would be the expectations about how they would deal with it? So, there's a lot that you would need to tease out before simply saying, yes, put it back in, or no, we're sticking with the recommendation.
Yes. Michael, have you any view on that?
Nothing to add to that, no.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, we're on table 12. And what suggestions have you got?
The citizens of this table had 5 requests for the ballot. The citizens were unanimously in favour of a permanent electoral commission which would be tackled with maintaining the standards and ethics of referendums and elections. A suggestion was made by a member that there should be a cut-off past which polls would no longer be allowed to be published, given that polls can influence turnout and discourage the attendance of voters. Number 3 was a citizen believed that the citizen's right to initiate a proposal for legislation rather than having a proposal initiated by the Oireachtas should be restored.
Just for legislation?
Yes.
Rather than the constitutional amendment?
Yes, that's what's written down. And there should be certain criteria necessary, for example, having a particular number of, a minimum number of legitimate signatures. Fourthly, a time frame should be enforced on the government to implement any changes passed by referendum. And finally, access to postal voting should be extended, and there should be a longer voting period introduced.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any other table? Table 13.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for table 13, and the citizens at this table have 2 questions for the panel, and then they have 3 questions for the ballot paper. First question, why do we have to register? Why is it not automatic? And is there a vested interest in keeping the system slow and cumbersome?
Do you mean to put your name on the electoral register? Is that what you're talking about, registering?
Why we have to register our name on the electoral register? What they were suggesting was that the data is already there from public service cards.
Not everybody has public service.
Yeah, and what's the second question?
Second question, is there a vested interest in keeping the system slow and cumbersome?
Oh, well, maybe.
Why do we register? I think basically we register because that was the way it was always done in Britain. But we have something in common, which is that we We've always set our face against identity cards because that smacks of authoritarianism, and we don't like that. And when any minister goes anywhere near something called an identity card, people freak out. In the Netherlands, you move into a house, you're put on the electoral register. I mean, they know, so they put you down. We don't do it like that. I think it would be great if we did it like that, but some people will freak out because they'll see it as authoritarian. Is there a vested interest? What on earth is the vested interest? Nobody knows quite who is off and who is on. It might be a bit of inertia, but it would be nice if the state made sure everybody was registered. But if that required you to have a citizen ID card, maybe that would be too much for people.
Yeah. Teresa?
I mean, the state does not keep anybody off the electoral register.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, when we think about the kind of standards of free and fair elections, you know, voter registration could be made easier, but it certainly meets the required criteria that would be, I suppose, set down for free and fair elections. We are very unusual in not having automatic voter registration, and indeed, actually, it's come up actually in the context of Brexit negotiations. When the UK leaves the European Union, we're then going to go down to a minority of countries. We'll be there on our own that don't actually do automatic registration. There's a slight variation in France, but we will be left very unusual, and that could have implications in terms of all kinds of other things that are actually linked to the register. So it's likely that this could become a more live issue in time, partly as a consequence of that, in addition to other things.
It's highly decentralised. I mean, it's a local authority thing, and some local authorities think they've got better things to spend their money on.
Yeah. And do you think there's a motivation,
No.
Teresa? Yeah.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something that's high up the political priority. It has, to an extent, in the last decade, been linked to this broader debate about an electoral commission.
Yeah.
And the general sense when we speak in the committees is that if there was a centralised electoral commission, it would be able to give greater priority to questions about registration, and perhaps could set standardised rules that would be applied by all of the local authorities themselves, because there's a general acceptance that there's an overestimation on the electoral registers, so that there are more people on the electoral register than there are actual voters. Now, a lot of that is actually because of administrative sclerosis. There isn't any real evidence to suggest it's causing fraud or even facilitating it.
Yeah.
But I think the Electoral Commission probably is part of the answer to that.
Yes.
In the medium term.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
But, now your suggestions for the ballot paper.
Judge. Should voting be switched to Sundays? Should the government consider putting together an online method for voting connected to your PPS number to encourage more voting? And lastly, do you think that issues subject to a referendum should be explained more clearly and made more interesting for people to understand? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Then we will do 8, table 8.
Thank you, Judge. The citizens at this table have no question for the panel. They had a number of observations, some of which have already been espoused by some of their colleagues on other tables, so I'll just deal with some of the newer ones. There was just a general consensus that historically, in terms of information provided around topics for referenda and other elections, that often the subject matter presented or shared by whichever commission is very complicated, and there's just far too much, the language is too intense, and that there was a feeling that simplifying the language, sharing the message in a more measured way would allow people to understand it better and to engage with it. Just also there was a suggestion that that the postal vote should be extended to everybody. There was also a suggestion that there would be a suitability, or that the PR system be further investigated in terms of how it might be applied in referenda. In terms of a question for the ballot, just the one additional question was, would people like to see a citizens/agenda initiative introduced in Ireland?
Very good. Do either of you have anything to say about the lack of simplicity in the language used?
I think some things are very complicated,
Yeah.
and it's probably difficult to put it into simplified language. I remember the Lisbon Treaty, then Taoiseach said, well, he hadn't actually read it all, and it's full of stuff that still come as news to people. And in that sense, it was complicated. In another sense, it was very simple. I did tell an Oireachtas committee once that, with all due respect, rather than having a superior judge head the Electoral Commission, it should be the head of a tabloid newspaper who knew how to speak to the public in words of one syllable. And whilst I don't entirely believe that, I think that the language needs to be that of the Daily Star and not the Irish Times.
Yeah. Teresa, what's your view?
I think plain English, or the idea of kind of plain English, has really been taken on board much more in recent years, and referendum commissions have actually made some effort to produce different types of booklets, so some are more complex than others, but inevitably there is a trade-off between the kind of complexity of the issues and the language that is required.
Yeah. Very good.
It's not one where there's a simple solution. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Table 1, then.
Table 1 just has one question in relation to voter registration for referenda. Voters have to be registered by November, I think it is, and the question is, should we be allowed to register much closer to the referendum if it's going to be in May or June, for example?
Okay, you are. There's a supplementary register produced in advance of each vote, and there's a possibility for voters to get onto the register at that particular point. The November date is the annual call for the register, so it's maintained on an annual base, but on each occasion there's an opportunity to get on the supplementary register, but it's quite time limited. You only have a number of days to do it. At referendums, I don't know how much emphasis is put on it, but for example at local and national elections, would-be candidates are very enthusiastic about getting extra voters onto the register so that they can cast their preferences for them. So that there is that opportunity, that provision is there already.
And is that publicised at the time if an election is called or if a referendum is?
Yes, certainly. And in a lot of work has been consolidated in recent years into the Check the Register site, and it's gone online, and you can now check whether you're already on the register. So that is often actually social media is used very effectively. And then on the November deadline every year, they use newspaper adverts, and actually there was a campaign just before Christmas, and there were radio advertisements, and again social media used to promote that. But it is true though that when the referendum or the election is called, you actually do only have a very short period of time, so it can actually be a number of days, so it can be tight.
Well, that's very useful information. Michael, any view on that?
No, I mean that's, as Teresa said, that you can register late. You could, in principle, give people more days if you needed. We'd need to know when the referendum is, and so many of our referendums have a very short lead-in time, which is why we keep appointing a referendum commission about 3 months after we should have appointed a referendum commission, and it's probably the same with the electoral register. If we just planned it out a bit better, people would have more time.
And that has been the view expressed by many of the commissions in their recommendations after.
Yes, everyone starts off by saying we should have been set up earlier.
Yeah, I know. Yes. Now, what about your suggestions?
Yeah, just I suppose they've mostly been mentioned. Weekend polling is one. A super referendum, should we have them, and if so, should there be a limit to the number that can be held at one time? And then should we make greater use of preferendums, given that Irish people are well used to proportional representation type elections? So they're the
Say that again.
In relation to referendums, should we make?
Sorry,
Apologies.
Yeah, thank you very much. Table 4. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The citizens at table 4 don't have any questions, but we have 5 recommendations
Very good.
for the ballot paper. Some have been dealt with to a greater or lesser degree by previous tables. The first one is that the changing of the date, say to a weekend date or adding an additional date. But the recommendation on this, if we were to add an additional day, that there would be a moratorium on the reporting of the polling until the polling is complete, in case that would influence the following day or other days. If polling should be carried out in an impartial setting, you know, where there would be no visible religious iconography.
That's in one of the written submissions. Yeah.
Okay. The one of the polling online and extending of the postal vote, which has been dealt with before. There should be a limited time frame for repeat referendum. And finally, to vote on whether we should have a super referendum.
Yes, very good. So we'll take all of those on board. And table 9, I think. Yeah.
I'm the facilitator at table 9. We've 9 suggested questions for the ballot paper, 2 of which have been proposed already. And we've 1 question for the panel. I'm just going to ask the citizen to ask it, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm a member at table 9. I just wanted to ask, to both members of the speakers at the table, do you see any merit in giving the responsibility for the dissemination of information on any given referendum to what might be called the newly expanded electoral/referendum commission, as it would be a source of real information that would be reliable and combat social media misinformation and help with fair, impartial and balanced debate?
Teresa?
I mean, the Referendum Commission does already do that. It provides neutral information on the specific question, and it's posted into every home. And
sorry, I'm not explaining myself properly. I remember. I've learned stuff over the weekend. I didn't realise they had other responsibilities, but I can remember the leaflets that come in through the door for a given referendum, and it's extremely limited. In the context of a newly resourced, bigger commission organisation, that they could do a more comprehensive version of providing that information, because it's very limited from what I can see in my own experience. If it was done well and done comprehensively, improved, it would be it would help the general referendum process.
Yeah, I think it depends as well on the referendum question. How far there's obvious information that should be provided to voters. That'll very much vary. But the Referendum Commission does provide reasonably detailed information on the question itself. But it also has to be careful, once you go into more detailed and longer explanations, you don't want to trade on one side of the argument or the other side of the argument. And the information that's provided by the Referendum Commission actually is very highly trusted and very influential, and the voters like it.
I'm wondering if, are they sort of jeopardising their function that way? Because if they were to start getting into the realms of for and against arguments, is that provide a conflict of interest with what their other objectives are?
Well, I guess the difficulty with the for and against arguments is it's kind of been rehearsed already. It's very hard to, give balance or weight to the arguments if they're presented just in a kind of a simple way. If you're given a list of here are the yes arguments and here are the no arguments, I mean, of that list, first of all, some might be more or less important, and when they're presented in that way, it's difficult to assess. And also, voters very often want to know who's telling them this information, because that matters a lot. Is it your political party that you might support, or is it a civic or voluntary organisation, for example, that you happen to have a lot of time for? So trade unions, churches, they can be very influential when they present information. So for voters, that type of information is provided much more effectively by partisans, by people who are campaigning and for whom these these things actually have meaning. The Referendum Commission actually conducts a very effective role, providing the broad parameters, also by encouraging turnout, which is something that we haven't mentioned today. It has a clear role there in terms of bringing the referendum to people's attention, telling them what day it's on, when the polling times are going to be, and it does that role. If you were going to give it a broader role and embed it within an electoral commission, one of the things that's kind of being aired is that it could be given a wider purview in relation to political education over a long period of time. And somebody mentioned a role in schools, that it might actually have a fairly regular campaign that it would run, providing information like what we got this morning.
Yes.
You know, how does the Constitution work? How is the Constitution changed? What does a referendum actually do? So it might, on a kind of permanent basis, be providing that information so that when a referendum actually comes along, voters are a bit more equipped to actually understand where it's come from, why the decision is being taken, and maybe the information they get then would be a little bit more helpful again. So, I mean, you could certainly put more information into the booklets, but if you're thinking about it in a permanent way, I think that the scope would be for broad political education, and there's a lot of support for that as well.
Michael, do you think the current sort of booklets are adequate?
I mean, two things I'd say about the current booklets. One is when people are asked, you know, what information was most useful for them, almost nobody ever mentions the referendum booklet from the Referendum Commission or the Referendum Commission's website or anything else to do with the Referendum Commission. So I think we need to get it in perspective. I think there's also something of a paradox, is that we want to empower citizens, give them the vote in referendums rather than leave it up to politicians, maybe even have lots of initiatives. And then we want the state to step in and tell us what the answer is. In a way, there should be no role for a referendum commission telling you what it's about. It's society that's supposed to do that. That's what we're put into, and you have to. That's part of being, you know, in a democracy, is you have to be able to sort this stuff out. And it's a bit odd to go back to the state and say, protect us from all this, please. We don't know what to do.
Well, believe it or not, I have retained many of the booklets in relation to recent referendums, and I've been looking at them obviously recently for obvious reasons. And I mean, I have to say, I think they're quite good. I don't think they are inadequate in terms of furnishing information. I would have looked probably at Lisbon more than others, but I think they are useful, and I think the commissions are to be complimented on the work they do.
And people do trust the Referendum Commission. That does come through in the research, that they do find them very trustworthy.
Yes, I wasn't meaning to say that what they do isn't good. I'm just saying that for most people, that's not the sort of information they want to consume.
Yeah. Right, then we'll find out what suggestions Table 9 have.
The suggestions are as follows, and I've omitted the ones that were previously raised. Suggested question: who should be responsible for implementing citizens' initiatives? The next question: should we have a super referendum days pre-scheduled? The next question: should there be a restriction in the number of questions proposed? Yes or no, and if yes, how many? Next question: should the postal vote be available for an extended period of time before the voting day? Next suggested question: should voters be able to vote at a location of their choosing? Next suggested question: should there be a national voter register available online to facilitate choice of location where a person votes? And the last suggested question: should referenda continue to be chosen by simple majority vote? Yes, no, and if no, should it be 55, 60, 65?
Very good. Thank you very much. Any other table? Have we done all tables now? Dealt with all questions? Oh yeah, we've just Table 9.
So I have a question for Professor Marsh and Dr. Reedy, one each. First of all, for Professor Marsh, what effect would lowering the voting age have on voter turnout, or what evidence is there to suggest which way it would be affected?
Are you talking about 16?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
16. And then does there exist an opposition to citizens' initiatives in Ireland? And if not, why do you think, for Professor or Dr. Reedy, why do you think they haven't? There isn't already a framework that exists for them.
Voting, let's say at 16, I think there are good arguments to say that would have a long-term effect of increasing turnout, because people would come to their first vote more often when they were enjoying a stable life. They were at school, they were at home, would be probably promoted by the school, rather than finding their first election when they're 20 and the world is just too much to keep hold of to ever get round to voting. And when they don't vote at 20, then they don't vote at 25, and they don't vote at 30, and then they never vote. And one can show turnout going down in Europe as a function of registering people at 18 rather than 21. Not because, well, in part because 18-year-olds are less likely to vote, but because they go on being less likely to vote generation after generation. So voting at 16, I think, would be a good idea. I don't know about opposition to citizens' initiatives, apart from myself. But
Yeah.
I mean, generally, citizens' initiative change the balance of power within a system. So any way you would introduce them would alter the power dynamic, and it gives a lot of influence to voters to set the agenda and even to make laws. So in that sense, those are in one part of the system already, where they have that exclusive power. I suppose they don't have very much incentive to change it, to give that power to somebody else. But I think we should qualify that by saying that the people who are in there who have the power at the moment are also chosen by the people there. So that's why we have to think about how representative democracy and direct democracy intersect. We shouldn't really see them as kind of competing or conflicting. They are all about votes by the citizens. I think there's a small group that campaigns to have these introduced, but I don't know that there's anybody who actively campaigns to keep them out. But I suppose this is a kind of a status quo and a change situation. So the status quo is that they're not there. So in terms of putting them in, you'd probably need a strong campaign to persuade people that they were a good thing and that they would be good for politics. And I suppose that probably isn't there either at the moment.
Very good. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that's everything, isn't it? We've covered all of the tables who want to be heard, and so I think we'll call it a day at this stage. And first of all, I must thank our speakers for their presentations, but also for the response. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the members for their engagement, for their contributions. Some of us will be working on their input later this evening, but I'm very, very grateful. It's been a very useful exercise. Thank you very much, and I hope that you'll have a pleasant evening this evening, and we'll see you all tomorrow at 9:30 tomorrow. Thank you very much.